Something bizarre happens in every trial, and I think that shows just what a despicable act sexual assaults are and why it does that. It's an assault on the personhood, and there's no other way around it. There's not anything worse.
Right. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hello, and thank you for joining me for episode 32 of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to start by expressing my deepest gratitude to all of my loyal listeners who've been with me on this journey of healing and empowerment. Your support and encouragement means the world to me. And for those of you who have responded to my invitation to write to me, I am truly humbled and in awe of the strength and resilience you've shown. For those of you joining me for the first time, I extend a warm welcome to you as well. This podcast is a safe space, a platform where victims, survivors, and experts come together to share their stories, insights, and knowledge, fostering a community that believes in empathy, understanding, and in bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Today, I have the privilege of reintroducing a great friend and colleague, Tim Cocanougher, who previously graced us with his wisdom in episode 6. Tim is a retired colonel from the JAG Corp of the U.S. Army National Guard and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in investigating and prosecuting sexual assault cases, both within and outside the military. In our last conversation, we delved into the trauma-informed approach to interviewing victims and survivors and the importance of being trauma-informed, ensuring their experiences are heard and respected. It was eye-opening, to say the least. Now, in this episode, Tim and I tackle another crucial topic that has been on our minds: the challenges faced in prosecuting rape and sexual assault cases. We aim to shed light on the reasons these cases often struggle to reach the courtroom, and even when they do, face uphill battles in securing convictions. Together, we explore the complexities of the criminal justice process, examining obstacles that victims and survivors encounter and the frustrations they may experience along the way. Tim's insights will not only provide invaluable knowledge to you, but also offer guidance to those who have felt bewildered and disheartened by the system. So, whether you're a survivor seeking understanding or an advocate striving for change, this episode promises to be comprehensive and enlightening. My intention is to empower you with the information needed to navigate these intricate issues and to foster a greater sense of compassion and support for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Once again, thank you for joining me on this powerful journey. Let's dive into this conversation with Tim Cocanougher and explore the question that so many have asked: why don't rape cases get prosecuted more often? Here's Tim. Tim Cocanougher, thank you for joining me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. It's great to have you back. For those of you who don't know, Tim is a good friend of mine, and he was on a previous episode, episode 6. So I'm not going to have him give a whole lot of background information, but Tim, remind our audience a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. I live in Kentucky, lifelong Kentucky resident, and been an attorney for about 40 years. Most of that I have been a prosecutor, a felony prosecutor. Also spent 34 years in the National Guard, first as an MP, military policeman, but most as a JAG officer. Also, as part of my National Guard service, towards the end of my career, I investigated sexual assaults for the Office of Complex Investigations in Washington, D.C., and that's where I met you, Dave, when you taught our class on how to properly investigate those type of cases.
Yeah, we did a 2-week course. It was called the Special Victims Unit Investigations course, and the primary goal was to teach the Office of Complex Investigations investigators techniques on how best to interview victims of sexual assault and rape without re-traumatizing them. Tim really did a great job in our last episode together, telling some of the stories and consequences of being through that course and the successes that he saw as an investigator utilizing the trauma-informed approach. I don't want to get too much into the weeds with regard to the neuroscience of trauma. I think what I'd like to talk to you about, Tim, is what happens after these cases get investigated and then forwarded to the prosecution portion of the criminal justice system. Can you explain a little bit for our audience what happens once you get these cases and what your experience is with these types of cases in terms of whether or not there's something you could take to court?
Sure. Just a caveat, I practiced all my life in Kentucky, and all states have their own state criminal code. Most of them are very, very similar, but what I'm going to be talking about is how Kentucky does it. So if you're in a different state, it may be a little different, but I'll give you that. But
Sure.
Most of what I'm saying, the other states are very, very similar. So first of all, I think people need to understand that as prosecutors, we're not investigators. In fact, there's some ethical issues if you try to get out and investigate a case. That's not our role. Our role is to wait for law enforcement to properly investigate the case and bring the file to us. Once we receive the initial report from the law enforcement agency and they say that they believe their case is complete, then we will go through that and we could then direct them that we want additional investigation, maybe additional witnesses or, physical evidence or something like that. And if we want other witnesses interviewed, we don't go interview those witnesses. We tell the police to do that or law enforcement. And even before they finish their final report, they will contact us early on and ask our advice on, who to interview and that sort of thing.
Right. So it's more or less like the prosecutor may be directing certain aspects of the investigation, but not participating as an investigator at all.
Correct. And mainly most questions, as you would know as a police officer, what we receive questions are legal issues. Mm-hmm. Can we do that? So we will make sure legally they stay on the straight and narrow so that if something's collected or something's done that's illegal or improper, then that could ruin the case. And that's, certainly not what we want. We love for law enforcement to contact us, even if they may pretty sure they know the answer, but if there's any catch in them at all, they need to call us just to make sure that there's not a mistake up front. Because as I said in the last podcast, the reason that you do your consulting and why you and I both are so passionate about wanting to train police officers, bottom line is if the investigation gets screwed up, it doesn't matter how good a prosecutor you are, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So it's crucial what the law enforcement does in the investigation to make sure that we can go forward. And that's the first thing we look at, Dave. We'll look at this case and we'll make sure that it's something that, based on the investigation, the elements of a crime can be proven. And if they can be proven, then you take it to a grand jury. And of course, a grand jury only has to determine probable cause, and it doesn't have to be unanimous. In Kentucky, it's 9-3. But in cases like this, and really in any case, no prosecutor likes to take a case to the grand jury when all you see is probable cause. You can look at a case and say, I can get an indictment, but gosh, I don't think there's any way I'd ever get a conviction. Well, you really shouldn't take that case to grand jury. You're wasting everyone's time. Mm-hmm. And that's how we do these cases. That's not required. Again, you don't have to have beyond a reasonable doubt to get a grand jury indictment. But if you know as a prosecutor, based on the evidence you have, that you're not going to be able to get a conviction, or there's, maybe a 0.5% chance, you really shouldn't take the case to grand jury. So that's the first thing we'd look at in these cases. Any case, but especially a sexual assault case.
Right. And for clarification, what we're talking about here is some measurement of standard for the difference between what's called probable cause, which means it probably happened the way the investigation shows that it happened. But for conviction, what the case has to have in the process of the trial, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's where you get the conviction. And that's a whole lot higher standard than the standard of probable cause.
Yes. Let me just give an example real quickly. Let's say you were trying to prove a murder and you had two different police agencies test the bullet fragment that was in the body in the deceased, okay? One police agency said it came from one person. Another police agency said, no, it did not. It came from another person. Well, but if you went to trial, both experts are going to get up there. And so there's no way to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. You just have to stay away from things like that.
And the other thing you mentioned too, that you have to stay away from is those mistakes of law. So if an investigator, for instance, did a search of a residence and that search wasn't done legally, if it didn't meet the standards for what is, again, probable cause to do a search, or in cases of a piece of property, having permission from the property owner or a warrant, but a search occurred without either of those, that evidence would not be admissible because it was obtained illegally. But let's say that investigator proceeded on with the investigation based on information gained during that illegal search and seizure of evidence. Then you have what is commonly referred to as fruit of the poisonous tree. In other words, everything after that is poisoned, is irrelevant, because how the initial evidence was obtained in the first place was illegal. And that can ruin a case, as you mentioned, from the get-go. And that's an important aspect of what you as a prosecutor are looking for, is to make sure everything was done legally.
Yeah, that is correct. And as prosecutors, we're wedded to the law. You're correct. Let's say we know that a police officer has done something illegally and that evidence, if it goes to trial, would not be used. Well, that's not going to be determined until you have an indictment. So we could say, okay, we know it's not going to be used, but let's get an indictment. We'll use it to get the indictment, even though we know it's going to be thrown out. That's unethical. We're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. Even if we think beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant did it, if we know that the evidence that we're going to need to prove that is going to be suppressed because of some sort of illegal search, then we're not going to take that to grand jury because we can't use the evidence. Why start the procedure when you know you don't have the proper evidence? So,
right. It's exactly right. It's dead in its tracks.
Right.
So that's a big aspect of maybe some explanation for people out there who are listening in on this. Why wasn't my case taken to court? All the district attorney's office or all the prosecutor's office would tell me was that there was some improper investigation, or that there was not enough evidence, or that the evidence obtained can't be used. And oftentimes, because of the load that prosecutors carry, they don't often explain everything in great detail to a victim or to witnesses who may be thinking they're going to get called for this trial, and it never even goes to trial, and they're wondering why and scratching their heads. I think that's an important aspect to understand and bring out to our listeners, is that these are some idiosyncrasies and parts of the initial process that determine whether or not one of these cases can actually make it into the courtroom.
Yeah, that's correct. We don't do this. I do not do this. My office does not do this. But I do know some prosecutors who, if the only evidence they have in a sexual assault is the testimony of the victim, there's no eyewitnesses, there's no physical evidence, and the defendant's denying it, then they won't take that to trial. We do. Now, they're very, very, very difficult to get a conviction on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I try to do, and what I wish the jury panels would fully understand, is I started jury selection, and throughout the whole trial, keep reminding them that the testimony that they hear from the witness stand, raises his or her hand, swears to tell the truth, and testifies, that is evidence. That is evidence as much as a DNA sample being confirmed by a lab tech. Mm-hmm. It's evidence. Now, the jury doesn't have to believe it, but it's evidence. And so what I explained to jurors from the very beginning, and especially in jury selection, when we're trying to select who should be sitting on this jury, is if you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim's telling the truth, that's enough for a conviction. You don't need anything else.
Correct.
And because a lot of our cases, that's what we have. The frustrating thing is, Dave, is that we'll do that. We'll just wear ourselves out saying that throughout the trial. And then there will be an acquittal. And we always talk to jurors afterwards. They don't have to, but if we call them, and most of them do, but we'll talk to them. And the very ones that we made promise us that, yeah, if I believe them, that's enough for me. They'll inevitably tell us, well, I did believe her. I really did, but I just needed a little more. It drives you crazy.
It's so frustrating.
But it's the real world.
Tim, I know in our personal conversations, we've talked about this before. I think maybe it's important for people to understand where it is that these things break down. What do you think is going on with regard to jurors who say, yeah, I believed them, but I just needed a little bit more? When they say things like that, what kinds of things are you hearing?
Talked to a juror who, and this was a case where it was the victim's word basically against the defendant who got on the stand actually and denied it in this case that I'm talking about. The victim, in my opinion, and I'll tell you, in the jury, some of the jurors' opinions who still voted to acquit, agreed that she was much more believable than him. But one juror in particular, he goes, I believed her. I really did. And he gave us reasons why. You could tell. I mean, he was very, very attentive to the trial. He was giving us reasons just right down the line of what she said and what we said in closing and opening. And then he said, upon more reflection, I didn't believe him. And then he's given reasons as to why he didn't believe him. And yet he told us that he was on the fence. We're like, well, what do you mean you're on the fence if you believed her and not him? He goes, well, I guess I shouldn't have been. Mm. Now, Dave, this is just me. This is not something studies I've read. When you do we've done trainings together. You give a great 2-hour long seminar on the rape culture, and it's excellent. I actually believe also defendants being acquitted are glorified. In other words, go back to Perry Mason. What did Perry Mason always do? What did they celebrate? They celebrated a defendant who was being tried and who was found not guilty. All the shows you watch, the John Grisham books, most of the time the main emphasis is a defendant who goes to trial and they're acquitted. And I've never really understood that. I think they believe when someone goes to prison, I've had them tell me this. I've heard them say, I just couldn't send him to prison. The beyond a reasonable doubt standard drives people crazy because in Kentucky, we can't define it. Neither the defense nor the prosecution can define it. And I have found when talking to jurors, they're not going to convict in any case, almost unless they're an eyewitness. They keep saying, well, I know he did it, but I'm just not 110% sure. Or not because you weren't there and you didn't see it. But they put that standard on themselves. I don't have an answer for it. Now, I'm saying this as if all the cases we do are acquittals, and they're not. We get a tremendous amount of convictions. But honestly, juries are, if it's a murder case, a robbery, a burglary, that sort of thing, drugs, it's easier for some reason for them to convict than it is on a sex assault case.
I think you're spot on that because as I think about what you're saying, it seems that jurors are a whole lot less likely to convict in sex assault or rape cases when there's that needed extra push to get off the fence than in almost any other type of case, because rape and sexual assault is so controversial. Most people don't understand consent and rape culture. And what I teach is that as a culture, we certainly look at the victim in these cases as the cause more than the perpetrator being the cause of rape. That's just not the reality of these types of cases. Victims don't ask for it. I don't care what they're doing. They're not asking to be raped. As you said, you can have somebody saying, I totally believe her, or I totally disbelieve the defendant, but I can't seem to bring myself to convict because what if I'm wrong? What if it was consensual? What if it was the victim's fault, or at least partially?
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the head right there, Dave. I think when they weigh where would I rather be wrong, they say, I'd rather be wrong that he did it and not go to prison than be wrong and he does go to prison for something he didn't do. I think that's what they weigh so heavily. And I also think that it doesn't matter what you give them, they're always going to find a reason. I had a case where the victim, excellent testimony. I mean, just classic trauma. You watch a trauma-informed interview, she just, every behavior that we would expect a sexual assault victim to exhibit, she did. And
those psychophysiological responses to trauma.
Right. In front of the jury. I mean, just very, very believable. And we talked, and this was a case also that was not acquitted, it was acquitted. And we talked to a female juror and she goes, well, I did believe her. We're like, well, and why did you acquit? Well, but I just needed a little bit more. Okay, you believed her, but you needed more. What did you need? Well, there was some text between her and the defendant, and maybe if the defendant had texted her something like, well, yeah, I'm sexually abusing you, then that would have been enough.
That outright, I did it.
Right.
I raped you. I sexually assaulted you. I did something I shouldn't have done to you sexually.
Yeah, exactly.
We're fighting an entire culture. Like I said, I keep reverting back to that terminology. It's rape culture.
I listened back to one of your old episodes today, and I forget which one it was, but it was a female. It may have been your last one. Maybe this was the last episode you did, because she said that this happened to me. her friend, female friend, said something like, well, didn't you tell someone immediately? And why didn't you? Didn't you fight? Didn't you? Well, and that's exactly what I would have done. They can't get that out of their head, but they don't know if it hasn't happened to them. And what happens during jury selection, this kind of goes back in all cases, is you weed out, if people have had issues with have been a victim or family member, they're not going to be on the jury panel. You've got people who have, if you've done a proper jury panel, you've got 12 people on there who have never experienced it. And so when you get up there and you tell them that, yes, this went on for 7 years before they reported it, that's just so counterintuitive to them. They don't understand that. They're
That's
like,
right.
That is crazy. And so that's what we're fighting as well. And I'm not blaming jurors on that. Honestly, I told people if I didn't have the knowledge that I do through trauma-informed interviewing and through prosecuting for that, I may be the same way. I don't know. Because as we know from doing trauma-informed interviewing and what we've learned behind the science, all of those things that are so counterintuitive is what we're looking for to prove that, yeah, I think this happened. And juries see it just the opposite.
Right.
They said it's proof that it did not happen. And so we're fighting that from day one. And I said this on the last podcast. Unfortunately, in Kentucky, we cannot bring in like a Dave Markell to explain why victims act in that way. So,
and that is not all that common, though. That is kind of unique to Kentucky, because I know a lot of states do allow expert witnesses to come in and explain, not specifically to that case, to that victim and to that perpetrator, what was going through their minds or what they did, but how in general, people who are experiencing trauma have these types of reactions, and people who are of a perpetrator mindset have these types of actions. And Kentucky doesn't allow that.
The most recent trial I did, I was able to do. I try to do this in all the cases, but during jury selection, I can discuss that. I can't bring in an expert, but I can discuss the trauma and how people react differently and delayed reporting and closing, but I cannot bring in an expert to go over exactly why that is.
Well, and it's part of my mission through this podcast and also through my training and consulting business to educate everyone on the neuroscience of trauma and what it means to be trauma informed. You know, if I'm talking to a criminal justice audience, they can apply it and relate to it much differently than lay people. And so my approach has to be different. My hope and goal and I guess dream is that everyone in our society would have a much, much better and deeper understanding of what trauma does to the brain and how people react to trauma. And sexual assault and rape is definitely trauma, and yet people don't apply some of the same concepts of trauma to rape and sex assault cases as they do to, for instance, a soldier in combat or someone who's been through a horrific airplane crash and survived, or train wreck or car crash. And they seem to understand more why a person would react in certain ways with post-traumatic stress issues from those types of incidents than they would from rape and sex assault. The body reacts to what the brain is dealing with is evidence of these horrific experiences of rape and sexual assault. And I think that's what you're alluding to here, is that very thing, that we need to get this information to a lot more people.
Oh, absolutely. And to go along with that, the other thing that I have learned from trying these cases is how prevalent sexual assaults are everywhere. It's not uncommon for us to start out with a jury panel and jury selection of, say, 120 or so. And, we may whittle them down to about 100 or 90 just on general questions. And then we ask all of them normally individually about, have you ever been a sexual assault victim or a family member or friend? Or have you or a friend or family member ever been charged or alleged to have committed a sexual assault? And normally out of 100 or 80 or 90 we have left, we usually get it down to maybe only having 6 or 7. We go through almost the whole panel before we can actually seat a jury. Mm-hmm. And half of those that we end up not being able to use actually tell us that, yes, they were sexually abused, maybe as a child, whatever. And some of them, I'm afraid, it may be the first time they've ever told anyone.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Now, that statistically is pretty well known. The last statistic I've heard is that a woman who experiences rape or sexual assault doesn't tell anyone on average for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. And with men, it's 21. And of those that do tell, the percentage is a whole lot lower than the ones who don't. And some people take that information to the grave. They never tell anyone that they were a victim of rape or sexual assault as a child or as an adult.
Yeah, I know most listeners think to your podcast are victims. And so if they're thinking about, should I take it to a prosecutor, maybe they've told friends or whatever, but they've never gone forward. It's such a tough call, because the one thing we do after we get the investigation and we think that everything is there, we'll have an initial interview with the victim. The prosecutors will, as long as it's a good interview. And obviously we don't go back and have them tell us what happened, because we've got that in the interview from the law enforcement. So we don't make them tell us the story again. In fact, we tell them at our first call that, look, we're not going to ask you about the incident, but we just want to talk to you, explain the process to you. And in many of these cases, Dave, we're not able to go forward because they say, I don't want to testify. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And we're not going to make them. I mean, we're just not. I'm not going to make somebody do that. In Kentucky, we have no statute of limitations for felonies, so we don't have an issue there. Some states do. But if you are a victim and you've never reported it, it's such a case-by-case basis. They are difficult. I don't want to dissuade anybody from reporting to law enforcement or to prosecutors. I'm hoping from what Dave and I are talking about right now will not make people say, well, why do it? Because I think in the end, it's better to do it for a lot of reasons. I've had cases that I get so frustrated on that it's so clear, at least in my mind, the defendant is guilty in these sexual assaults, and maybe, might be an acquittal. And then I'm really down and depressed, and we'll get a letter or a text or an email from the victim who said, I hate the verdict, but you guys believed in me and you're the first ones that ever did. And now I'm motivated to continue with my life and keep going because I was able to stand up in front of the jury and tell that defendant what he did to me. When a jury acquits someone, that doesn't mean he didn't do it. That just means they didn't think there was enough evidence. And I hope victims will understand that. And I've had a lot of victims who have basically understood that very well and said, I wanted him to go to prison, but at least I got my say. It's a release for a lot of victims to be able to do that. It's all on such a case-by-case basis. So it's just a difficult decision to make.
I'm just so appreciative of the fact that you brought that up, because it's where I was going next. In fact, that is what is, I think, important to most victims and survivors that I've ever dealt with in the law enforcement aspect and work that I did, as well as a trainer and consultant and presenter, and now as a podcaster. What I hear is that victims are so grateful when someone actually believes them and takes actions that show not only orally, yes, I believe you, but for a prosecutor to take a case to court and argue it and fight for that victim, even if there's an acquittal, as you just mentioned, it is so important that victims and survivors know that their story is heard and believed by someone, especially someone in a position of authority who tries to do something in terms of bringing justice to that victim. And I've said this numerous times, justice doesn't always mean conviction. Justice usually means being believed and not being blamed for their own crime. And I think that's an important aspect of all of this. So I'm glad you brought that up.
That's going to follow that person around more so than they think. They may not be in prison, but people are going to look at them differently. They just are. And then on the other hand, had a really good conviction on a sexual assault case, and he was actually maxed out on the number of years that he could get in prison. I think he got 70, which is the max we have in Kentucky. And the thing about that is it takes a perpetrator off the streets. It's just a tough area of the law. Like I've talked to jurors afterwards, after convictions and acquittals, who say they haven't slept for 2 weeks after. Either way, that's how much they can't eat, they can't sleep. That's after the trial. I mean, it affects them that much as well too. It's just such an emotional issue for everyone involved. But what I'm hoping for victims listening to this throughout the United States and the world, because I know your last two were from New Zealand, I'm just hoping if you do decide, if you haven't reported and you decide to, that I'm just hoping that the prosecutors and the investigators that you get properly trained and will take it serious. The other thing, though, to remember is if they don't take it to a grand jury or go further, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe you. It just means that there's not evidence there, that they just know they're wasting everyone's time and yours as well. I'm not going to put a victim through a case, and any ethical prosecutor is not going to put any victim through a case when I know there's almost zero chance of getting a jury conviction. So it may be something where some evidence is tainted or something's gone wrong. And so the prosecutor might look at you and say, I believe you. I believe it happened. But there's just no way to get conviction.
I look at that, Tim, and I think in addition to what you're saying is I'm protecting you.
Right.
Yeah, I believe you, but I also need to protect you, not only from wasted time, but from the grief of what would occur to you and your family members, everyone involved in this, if we push forward knowing that we're not going to get a conviction. And it's part of the prosecutor's ethic. You can't take a case forward if you know that it's more than likely not going to result in a conviction. Am I right?
That's exactly right. And in fact, if we've got a case that's been indicted and something happens and we know that we don't have enough evidence for beyond a reasonable doubt, it's really our duty to dismiss it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a critical issue for those who are listening to understand that that's an ethical and proper response on the part of a prosecutor, that sometimes these cases should not move forward. But you also hit another nail on the head earlier when you talked about hoping that the people who are investigating these cases and prosecute these types of cases, they need to be properly trained. And so often I've read decisions both in the military and in the civilian sector where a prosecutor will send a response back to me as an investigator of the reasons why they would not take a case forward. It was wording such as, the victim is not believable. The victim did certain things that make this look like the victim was consenting. The victim this, the victim that, and it's victim blaming. And the victim's story isn't consistent. Well, of course it's not consistent. Trauma does that to the brain. The victim kept changing her story or his story. Well, of course they kept changing his or her story. That's what trauma does to people oftentimes. And that's why it's so incumbent upon the investigators to be trauma-informed, trauma-trained, know what trauma brains do with these types of situations when it comes to things like chronological order of how things went down. They're not going to remember chronological order or peripheral versus central details of memory. Well, peripheral memory isn't very good in trauma situations. Central memory is. But that central memory can be so isolated and so fragmentary that the way it looks to an uninformed investigator or prosecutor is that the victim or survivor is purposefully leaving critical information out or withholding information, when in actuality, that's not the case at all. And the only way to ensure that is to make sure that our investigators and prosecutors are trauma-informed and are educated. There's recent research that shows that how a victim's story is received by the investigator in terms of whether or not that investigator is trauma-informed or not, or believes that victim from the very start, has such a tremendous impact on that victim in terms of that victim's mental health from that point on. And it affects their relationships with their other family members. It affects their earning capacity. It affects how they move forward. It affects their mental health for the rest of their life based on how they are received, how their story is received by the person who's supposed to be investigating and or prosecuting these cases. And if they're blaming the victim or not believing the victim from the start, the psychological and mental damage that can happen is devastating to victims of rape and sexual assault. So it's critical. And by all means, if you're a listener and you're going to report your rape or sexual assault, I would do a little bit of research yourself into the agency that you're going to be reporting to. And if it's a local police department, find out if that investigator has been through some sort of trauma-informed training. And if they have not, you have the right to move on to a different law enforcement agency, and that would be the county. And so instead of filing with a municipality, you could report to a county law enforcement official. And if they aren't trauma-informed, you can report to a state investigative agency. And you could actually even report to the state attorney general's office because they have investigators. So you're not limited necessarily. Depends upon your situation and where you live and state law, et cetera. But for the most part, there are other avenues of reporting your rape or sexual assault to law enforcement other than just the immediate jurisdiction that you think you should be reporting to. Do all you can to make sure that you're reporting to somebody who, for one thing, is going to start the investigation by believing you.
Yeah, Dave, that's great advice. I really can't add anything to it. And that's exactly what needs to be done. And That's what you and I see it as a prosecutor. You've seen it through your training is, again, when I pick up a case, I know immediately whether or not the investigator was properly trained. It doesn't take 5 minutes of reading the report to know. So one good thing, some of our people from our office train like in domestic assaults and strangulation. And we received a report from an officer, a supervisor, who sent it to our trainer and said, look at this report, because the officer asked all the questions that needed to be asked for strangulation, and they had never done that in the past. And it was like, hey, we're getting through, so so that's what we need, because that's where it all begins.
Law enforcement is actually receptive and obtaining this training and applying it. It's one thing to receive the training, it's another thing to apply it. So and I think the same goes for the trauma-informed approach to sexual assault and rape cases is that you just referred to with regard to strangulation. We need to get the training out there, and we need to make sure that it's being implemented and practiced. Otherwise, things aren't going to change. We're going to stay in our rape culture and not move. I think one of the best recent episodes that I did was with Nicole Florisi, who basically said the same thing. We know all the right things to do. Now let's do it. Stop talking about it. Stop just training it. Stop just listening to it from a trainer. Start implementing this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's not much more you can say about that, because the front line is so important. It really is. And I want most of these, again, I know our comments are mostly aimed at hopefully victims who are listening to this that are trying to get some sort of information as to what happened or what they can do. Another thing that I did want to mention, I kind of said it, but I want to go into more detail for any victims out there who maybe have gone to jury trial and their case has been acquitted or the defendant was acquitted. What I've learned through my cases is from talking to jurors is, and this is frustrating, but just so you'll know, and I don't know if this makes you feel better or not, this has happened to you as a victim, but what I have found many times, even though the jury believed you, they still acquitted. And here's how this happens. We actually had a case recently where there's an acquittal, and everybody had already gone, and we walked outside the courthouse, and one of the jurors was sitting there himself on a bench, and we went and started talking to him, because in Kentucky we can talk to them if they want to talk to us. They don't have to, but they can if they want. And he started crying because he said, I believed her. I know he did it. I let them talk me into going ahead and doing not guilty, and I know he's guilty. And actually, in that case, we called 4 or 5 jurors who kind of said the same thing. That they went in saying, yeah, he's guilty.
Wow.
But what happens, and this is studies, I learned this in law school, and it's true. In juries, 12 people usually have 2 leaders and 10 followers. And if there had been a strong leader on that, the one I'm talking about, let's say there was a really strong leader on guilt. If the guy who was talking to us had been a really strong leader, the one who was crying, we would have got a guilty verdict, or at least a hung jury. But basically, it just comes down to 1 or 2 people who convince everybody else. And then you always have 2 or 3 in the jury who they could care less. They just want to get out of there. As soon as they get in the room, it's like, I don't care. I'll vote any way you want. I just want to go home. But my son was on jury duty recently, and he said somebody sent him a meme that says, miss work, get paid $12 a day, and go decide the fate of somebody's life. That'd be a fun day. Something like that.
Yeah,
I mean, they come from all walks of life. Ours just come from their driver's license. So you've got anywhere from 18 years old and just out of high school up to 80 and can barely hear. They can be PhDs, doctors. They can have 0 education, and yet you're putting these really difficult things in front of them, and then you're putting 12 strangers together. That's why the studies have shown that if you have just 1 or 2 leaders, the other people they fall in line. They'll just follow whatever just to get out of there. And so, again, I guess what I'm just trying to say, it's a long way to say it, though, is if you have been a victim and if you went to jury trial and the jury found for the defendant, please understand that does not necessarily mean the jurors did not believe you. They just gave in to us. Maybe one of the 12 believed, and he just badgered the rest of them. That happens sometimes. I'm not saying it did happen. We just don't know. So jury system is just it's its own little creature.
Well, I think ultimately the goal of our conversation here today is to enlighten victims and survivors about the whole process of what it takes to get a case from an investigation into the courtroom or not into the courtroom. And then once it's in the courtroom, what needs to happen in order to get a conviction. And not only that education, but the education of why it's so important to be trauma informed. And I think we've covered so much with regard to those three topics. And I think our listeners are that much better off for this episode. And I can't thank you enough for your input, your wisdom, your experience, and your comments about all of these things, because it's so spot on and so helpful. Thanks for doing this with me.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I really enjoy being able to at least use what experiences I've had. And you and I are the same on this. We really want to help victims. That's why we're doing this, because we understand more than most because of our training of what they've gone through and just the difficulties that they still face every day. So if there's any little ray of information we can give them or nugget that will be helpful, then it's worth it. And that's what we hope to do.
Absolutely.
Even though we've learned a lot about it, it's still always an evolving subject. And the fact that I'm still prosecuting, I'm still learning. Every trial is different. Something bizarre happens in every trial. And I think that shows just what a despicable act sexual assaults are and why it does that. It's an assault on the personhood. And there's no other way around it. There's not anything worse.
Right. I can see how this episode then will lead to more discussions between you and I, and probably lead to yet another episode. I'm looking forward to the possibility of having you back.
Well, thanks, Dave. Again, anytime. Be glad to do it. Thank you.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to extend my deepest gratitude and heartfelt thanks to Tim Cocanougher for sharing his time with me for this episode, as well as his vast knowledge and experience in maneuvering the complexities of the criminal justice system. I also want to express my appreciation to both my dedicated listeners and to those who are joining me for the first time. Your time spent with me is truly valued, and I hope that Tim's insights have educated and inspired you. Please spread the word about this episode and the SAS podcast to everyone you know. And don't forget to rate this episode and subscribe to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Your ratings and subscriptions contribute to the growth of this podcast and play a vital role in seeking justice for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. I want to extend my invitation once more to those of you who have been raped or sexually assaulted and feel you're ready to share your story with others in the pursuit of furthering your own healing and providing guideposts in helping others heal. Just email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com. And we'll talk about the possibility of you being on one of my episodes. Please remember to do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. The best way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.